Stay in the vehicle. Do not reach for anything.
What is this? Why are you surrounding us?
Now, license, identification. Hand them through the window.
I have a work permit. I have legal status. I have a lawyer.
Now, documents. Do not explain. Hand them through.
She has an appointment. She was
ICE told us. Sir, do not speak.
Please. My daughter, she just got on the bus, please.
It was 7:15 in the morning. The sun had barely risen over Nashville, Tennessee, when Estefany Rodriguez kissed her 7-year-old daughter goodbye at the bus stop, watched the little girl board the school bus, and walked back to the car where her husband, Alejandro, was waiting. The vehicle she climbed into wasn't just any car. It was a marked news vehicle, the logo of Nashville Noticias printed clearly on the side. A journalism car. A press car. The kind of car that, in a country built on the First Amendment, should have been one of the safest places in America to sit. It wasn't. Within minutes, multiple vehicles came out of nowhere and surrounded the news car on all sides. Men stepped out. They weren't in uniform at first glance. But they had badges. And they had authority. And they had one mission. Take the reporter. Estefany Rodriguez, a 35-year-old journalist from Colombia who had spent years in Nashville covering the stories that other reporters wouldn't touch, was about to be arrested. Not for anything violent. Not for anything criminal. Not for any act of wrongdoing that a jury would ever be asked to weigh. She was going to be taken because, her attorneys would later argue, she had been doing her job too well. She had been covering IC. And now, ICE was coming for her. Music swells, title card. They came for the reporter. The story of Estefany Rodriguez, a Nashville journalist, an IC detention, and a nation's reckoning with the free press. To understand why this story shook the country, you first have to understand who Estefany Rodriguez is. She wasn't a famous journalist. She didn't anchor a major network broadcast or appear on cable news panels. She was a local reporter, the kind of journalist that holds communities together from the ground up. She worked for Nashville Noticias, a Spanish-language news outlet that serves the Latino community in Middle Tennessee. She also contributed to Univision 42 Nashville. Estefany Rodriguez was born in Colombia. She grew up watching journalists do what journalists are supposed to do: hold power accountable, tell the stories the powerful don't want told, give a voice to people the system was designed to silence. And she became one of those journalists. In Colombia, she worked for a major broadcaster. She reported on government agencies, corruption, and the kind of stories that attracted powerful enemies. Her beat included coverage of armed militia groups, guerrilla organizations, and corrupt politicians who had no interest in being exposed. And they weren't quiet about their displeasure. She began receiving threats. The kind of threats that aren't just words, the kind that come with enough specificity and credibility to be taken seriously. She reported those threats to Colombian police. She reported them to the country's prosecutor's office. For a while, she was assigned a security detail. But security details in Colombia are temporary. The threats were not. Her father, Juan Rodriguez, would later describe the impossible situation his daughter faced. "There are a lot of problems," he said, "including armed groups, guerrillas, corrupt politicians. When you report, you'll find that some of these people don't like what you're reporting on, and they'll get bothered and think they have to get rid of the reporter because the reporter is making too much noise and informing the public." When Estefany's daughter turned 1 year old, she made a decision. She was going to find safety. For herself. For her child. And she was going to go to the United States, a country that, from where she stood, represented something specific. A free press. A constitution that protected journalists. A place where covering the truth wasn't supposed to get you killed. Here is the part of this story that matters enormously, because it is the part that the government would later try to bury. Estefany Rodriguez did not sneak into the United States. She did not cross a border illegally. She did not try to hide from the law. She did not run from the system. She came through the front door. In March 2021, Rodriguez entered the United States legally, on a tourist visa. And before that visa expired, she did exactly what immigration law instructs people in her situation to do. She filed a claim for political asylum, a legal process that has existed in American law for decades, designed specifically for people who face persecution, threats, or danger in their home countries. She had the death threats documented. She had the police reports. She had the evidence. She applied for asylum. Then her life in Nashville began. She joined Nashville Noticias in 2022. She started building a career. She covered social issues, health stories, family stories, police stories, and immigration stories. She married Alejandro Medina, an American citizen. And through her marriage, she filed a petition to adjust her immigration status to lawful permanent resident, the legal pathway to a green card that exists specifically for people in her situation. She had a work permit, valid through 2029, issued by the United States government. Legal and documented. Her attorneys would later lay all of this out in court filings with methodical precision. Rodriguez entered legally. She applied for asylum legally. She married a U.S. citizen. She filed for a green card through proper legal channels. She had a valid work permit. She was following every step the immigration system laid out for her. Her attorney, Joel Coxander, described her this way. She is somebody that has been trying to follow the rules the whole time. And the rules, as far as Stephanie Rodriguez and her legal team understood them, were being followed. Until January 2026, when a letter arrived. In January 2026, Stephanie Rodriguez received an unexpected notice from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The letter instructed her to appear at the Nashville ICE field office for processing and additional information. It wasn't an arrest notice. It wasn't a deportation order. It was a meeting request. The kind of thing that, on its surface, sounds routine. Rodriguez and her legal team took it seriously. Attorney Coxander helped her compile folders full of documents: her asylum application, her marriage records, her green card petition, her work permit, her legal history. They prepared arguments. They built a case for why IC should not initiate removal proceedings against her. They were ready. Then Nashville got hit by an ice storm. The city shut down. Roads were impassable. The IC office itself closed its doors. The appointment, through no fault of Rodriguez or her attorneys, could not happen. ICE rescheduled. A new letter arrived. A new date, February 25th. Rodriguez and her team adjusted. They prepared again. And 2 days before the rescheduled appointment, on February 23rd, her husband Alejandro and attorney Caleb Mundy made a proactive decision. They went to the IC office themselves, in person, to confirm details. They wanted to ask whether IC could send the charging documents directly to Rodriguez's legal team, rather than requiring her to appear in person. What they were told stopped them cold. The duty officer at the IC office ran Rodriguez's alien registration number through the system. "She's not in the system," the officer said. "This appointment's not in the system. The appointment didn't exist. There was no record of it. No active case. Nothing." Coxander would later describe the absurdity of this moment with visible frustration. ICE would later claim that Rodriguez had missed 2 appointments, and that those missed appointments made her a flight risk. But how do you show up for an appointment that the agency itself says doesn't exist? And here is the detail that makes the entire sequence feel like something other than accident or administrative error. 2 days after that ICE officer told Rodriguez's husband that the appointment wasn't in the system, 2 days after that assurance, ICE had Rodriguez's case active enough to send multiple vehicles to surround her car and take her into custody. The charging documents, they had told her attorneys, were still being finalized. That was before the arrest. When her attorneys checked with IC about her case, they were told charging documents were still being worked on. And then, on March 4th, before any of that paperwork was complete, before any court had made any ruling, before any due process had played out, ICE agents were following Rodriguez, her husband, and their 7-year-old daughter as they left their home in the early hours of the morning. It is worth walking through what happened that morning moment by moment, because the details matter. An IC enforcement and removal operations Nashville Fugitive Operations team was following Rodriguez's family as they left their home. They followed the family to the school bus stop. They watched as the 7-year-old girl, Rodriguez and Alejandro's daughter, got on the bus. And then they waited. They waited until the child was gone. Until she was safely on that bus and out of sight. And then they moved. The family car, the Nashville Noticias news vehicle with the outlet's logo visibly displayed on the side, was surrounded by multiple vehicles. Several men stepped out and approached the windows. Alejandro Medina would later describe the moment. He said he understood what was happening before his wife did. Before Estefany could process what was unfolding around her, her husband had already recognized the reality. "ICE. We really couldn't understand why we're being surrounded," he said. The agents knew details. According to Medina, they knew he was born in the United States. They knew the couple had applied for a green card. They had information. They had been watching. This was not a random encounter. Estefany Rodriguez was taken into custody. She was placed in a vehicle. She was taken to a holding room. And here is the moment that her attorneys would later flag as central to everything. At no point during the sequence, from the parking lot to the vehicle to the Nashville holding room, was Rodriguez ever shown a warrant. Not in the parking lot. Not in the car. Not at the holding room. Her attorneys later obtained ICE's own internal report of the arrest and examined it carefully. That report, they argued, showed that from the moment agents approached Rodriguez to the moment she arrived at the Nashville ICE office, she was never presented with a warrant. The government would later file a crumpled, photographed, not scanned, administrative warrant, dated March 2nd, 2 days before the arrest. The documents. Certificate of Service. Section, the part that lists the name and location of the person who was formally served, was blank. Her attorneys were direct about what that meant. Estefany Rodriguez was arrested without a warrant. Her husband, an American citizen, was left standing in that parking lot watching his wife be taken away in a government vehicle. Their daughter was on a school bus, not yet knowing that by the time she came home, her mother would be gone. Now let's step back for a moment, because there is something about this story that goes beyond the legal questions, beyond the warrant dispute, beyond the immigration technicalities. And it's this. Estefany Rodriguez didn't just happen to be a reporter who got detained by ICE. She was a reporter who covered ICE. She was a journalist whose beat included showing up to document what ICE was doing in Nashville. To report on the arrests. To give names and faces to the people being detained. To tell the stories that the agency preferred go untold. The day before her own arrest, she had been covering ICE activity in Nashville. Let that sit for a moment. The day before she was detained, she was doing her job, reporting on ICE enforcement operations in her community. And the next morning, ICE enforcement agents were following her car. Her attorneys did not use the word coincidence. They used the word retaliation. In court filings, her legal team argued that Rodriguez's arrest, her denial of bond, and her rapid transfer to an out-of-state detention facility indicated retaliation against Rodriguez in violation of the First Amendment due to her work as a journalist, including reporting on ICE. Attorney Coxander later amended his petition to specifically argue a First Amendment violation, that the government had detained a journalist, at least in part, because of what she was reporting. The Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition issued a statement that was direct about what they believed was happening. "It's not lost on us," their statement read, "that as a reporter, Estefany honestly and courageously told real stories about the harms caused by ICE and the people they targeted and detained." Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell weighed in as well, saying Estefany's case was yet another example of how this is not about dangerous criminals or even actual legal status, because she has been in the process of asylum review. The National Association of Hispanic Journalists spoke out. The Committee to Protect Journalists spoke out. Investigative reporters and editors spoke out. Every major journalism advocacy organization that covers press freedom immediately understood what was at stake. This was not just about one woman's immigration case. This was about whether reporters who cover powerful government agencies can be targeted by those same agencies for doing their jobs. And the answer, if Rodriguez's detention stood without consequence, was beginning to look like yes. Now, this story has two sides, and fairness demands that both be laid out. ICE and the Department of Homeland Security presented their own version of events. ICE's position was this: Estefany Rodriguez had no lawful immigration status. She had entered on a tourist visa in March 2021, a visa valid until March 23 of that year, just 13 days. When she did not depart by that date, she was, by the government's definition, in violation of her visa. A Department of Homeland Security spokesperson stated publicly that a pending green card application and work authorization did not give someone legal status to be in the country. ICE also claimed that Rodriguez had failed to appear for 2 scheduled immigration appointments, and that those failures made her a flight risk, justifying detention. That is the government's argument, presented plainly. But here is where the government's position runs into problems. First, her attorneys argued that the appointments were missed due to circumstances beyond Rodriguez's control, specifically the Nashville ice storm that shut down the city and closed the ICE office itself, and an ICE officer who told her husband and attorney 2 days before the second appointment that the appointment wasn't even in the system. Second, the warrant dispute. ICE produced a warrant dated March 2, 2 days before the arrest. But the warrant's certificate of service was blank, and their own arrest report showed she was never presented with that warrant during the actual detention. Her attorneys argued this meant the arrest was warrantless, a Fourth Amendment violation. Third, the timing. The arrest came 1 day before former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was scheduled to speak at a conference in Nashville. Rodriguez's outlet had a documented history of reporting that challenged ICE's public narrative. The proximity of events raised questions that neither ICE nor DHS moved quickly to answer. Fourth, the flight risk claim. Coxander pointed to the fundamental contradiction in ICE's argument. Her husband and attorney literally went to the ICE office 2 days before the appointment, he said. Like we're not blowing it off. People who are flight risks don't send their attorneys to ICE offices to confirm meeting times. The questions piled up faster than ICE was answering them. While lawyers were filing emergency petitions in federal court, Estefany Rodriguez was being moved. After her arrest on the morning of March 4, she was transported through the system at a pace that her attorneys described as unusually fast, a pace that, they argued, was itself a sign that something more than routine procedure was underway. By Thursday, March 5, she was in Alabama. By Friday, March 7, she was en route to a detention center in Louisiana. Her legal team was scrambling, filing emergency motions, trying to establish a stable legal foothold before their client was moved so far from Nashville that the court filings became logistically complicated. Back in Nashville, her daughter went home from school to find her mother gone. Her husband Alejandro Medina, an American citizen, a man born in this country, a man with every right to expect his wife to be home, was left navigating the gap between the life they had been building and the reality of a federal detention system that had swallowed her whole. A GoFundMe was set up for Rodriguez's family and her mounting legal bills. The Nashville community responded. Nashville Noticias released a public statement. The outlet expressed respect for U.S. law while calling for a resolution that would allow Rodriguez to come home to her daughter and her husband and continue her legal immigration process. We trust in the justice system of the United States of America, the statement read. It was a line that, given everything that had just happened, required enormous faith to write. Her attorneys filed an emergency petition in federal court, a writ of habeas corpus. In plain terms, that is a legal demand that the government justify, in front of a judge, why it is holding someone. It is one of the oldest legal protections in the English-speaking world, stretching back to the Magna Carta. It is the legal system saying, if you have someone in custody, you have to explain why. United States District Judge Eli Richardson was assigned to the case. The judge issued a deadline. The government had until midnight to file a response explaining its legal basis for the detention. Her attorneys filed additional amendments to the petition, expanding the legal arguments to cover not just the habeas claim but specific First Amendment and Fifth Amendment violations. First Amendment, that the government had targeted a journalist because of her reporting. Fifth Amendment, that her due process rights had been violated. The government filed its response. It attached the warrant, the crumpled, photographed document with the blank certificate of service. It argued that Rodriguez had lawfully been detained for immigration violations. Rodriguez's legal team dissected the government's response and came back with precision. They pointed to the blank certificate. They pointed to the IC arrest report that showed Rodriguez was never shown the warrant. They argued, plainly and directly, that the government's own documents proved their case. She had been arrested without proper process. The court hearings that followed were watched closely by press freedom organizations across the country. A March 21 hearing was scheduled. Bond motions were filed. The case had moved from a parking lot in South Nashville to a federal courtroom, and what happened next would set precedent, not just for Estefany Rodriguez, but for every journalist in America who covers powerful government agencies. Let's step back now and look at this story from a higher altitude, because there are things happening here that go beyond one woman's case. In recent years, journalism in the United States has been operating in a climate that has grown increasingly hostile to reporters who cover immigration enforcement. ICE operations, by their nature, happen quickly and often without advance notice. Reporters who cover them must be present, in the field, sometimes in the same locations as the people being detained. That is exactly what Estefany Rodriguez was doing. She was present. She was in the field. She was documenting. And in September 2025, just months before her arrest, the U.S. Supreme Court had issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through civil rights and immigration communities. The court ruled that federal agents could use racial profiling as a basis for investigations, including detentions and arrests. That ruling changed what was legally permissible. And in that new environment, Rodriguez was arrested. She was not the first journalist to be caught in the machinery of immigration enforcement during this period. Mario Guevara, a Salvadoran journalist, was deported in October of 2025 after being arrested while covering a protest in Atlanta. But Rodriguez's case was different in at least one critical way. She was arrested while in a marked press vehicle. She was, in the most literal and visible sense, a journalist doing her job as a journalist when the government took her into custody. Her outlet's spokesperson, Aguilar, spoke about what this moment meant for reporters in the field covering IC operations. Reporters and photojournalists, we run towards a fire as everybody else is running away, Aguilar said. Well, this is the fire. ICE agents out there with masks and guns just taking people off the streets. This is a time where journalists have to decide, are we going to take it or do we push forward and report what we see, what we hear, what we are told? We have a challenging time right now, Aguilar added. That is an understatement that speaks volumes. If a journalist who covers a government agency can be detained by that same government agency, without a warrant, according to her attorneys, and potentially in retaliation for her reporting, then press freedom in America is not just under pressure. It is being tested in real time, with real human stakes. Estefany Rodriguez is not a symbol. She is a person. She is a mother. She is a wife. She is a journalist who fled death threats in one country to do her job freely in another, and found herself inside a detention center in Louisiana while her daughter came home from school to an empty house. That is not abstract. That is a life. That is a child waiting for her mother to come home. While the legal battle played out in federal court, something else was happening in Nashville. The community responded. And it responded loudly. The Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, TIRRC, issued statements and organized support. They were unequivocal about their position. The detention of a journalist who had covered IC honestly and critically was not acceptable. Yuri Kunza, president and CEO of the Nashville Area Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, spoke about the broader moment. He had personally traveled to Washington multiple times to advocate for a humane, lawful approach to immigration enforcement. We're protecting America's workforce, he said. That's our message, which involves everyone in America. And there has to be a way that is humane and is in compliance with the law. Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell continued to speak about the case publicly, calling it an example of why some of the federal policy approaches are not right for Tennesseans, and they're certainly not right for Nashville. National journalism organizations maintained sustained pressure, calling for Rodriguez's release and watching the court proceedings carefully. Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro addressed the case directly on social media, saying ICE had arrested the journalist without a warrant, and describing her detention as part of what he called the Trump admin's machine of cruelty that is attacking the free press and violating our rights. The DHS fired back on social media, defending the legality of the detention. The back and forth was happening in public, in courts, in newsrooms, and in the streets. This case had become a referendum on what the First Amendment means when it collides with immigration enforcement, and on whether those two things can coexist in the same country at the same time. Let's break down the legal arguments at the heart of this case, because they matter and they deserve to be understood clearly. The Fourth Amendment argument. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures. Generally speaking, arresting someone requires either a valid warrant or circumstances that meet specific legal standards that justify an exception. Rodriguez's attorneys argued that she was arrested without a valid warrant. The document ICE produced was incomplete, appeared to have never been formally served, and ICE's own records showed it was not presented to her during her detention. If true, the arrest violated her Fourth Amendment rights. The First Amendment argument. The First Amendment protects freedom of the press. While the First Amendment does not make journalists immune from immigration enforcement, it does prohibit the government from retaliating against journalists for their reporting. If the government targeted Rodriguez because she was covering ICE critically, if her journalism was a factor in her detention, that would constitute First Amendment retaliation, which is constitutionally prohibited regardless of immigration status. The Fifth Amendment argument. The Fifth Amendment protects due process rights. Rodriguez's attorneys argued that her rapid transfer out of state, her denial of bond, and the procedural irregularities in her case violated her right to fair process under the law. ICE's counterarguments. ICE maintained that Rodriguez had no lawful status, having overstayed her visa, and that her failure to appear at 2 appointments justified treating her as a flight risk. They argued the warrant was valid and that the detention was a lawful enforcement action. The fundamental legal question being asked in a federal courtroom was this: can the United States government arrest a journalist without a proper warrant, transfer her rapidly across state lines, and hold her in a detention center? And if the answer to any part of that question involves her journalism, does the First Amendment have anything to say about it? Those are not small questions. They are questions that will shape the legal landscape for journalism and immigration enforcement for years to come. There is one voice in this story that deserves more space than the headlines gave it. Juan Rodriguez. As Stephanie's father, he watched his daughter grow up wanting to tell the truth. He watched her build a journalism career in Colombia, knowing the risks. He watched her receive death threats for reporting that made powerful people uncomfortable. He watched her decide, when her daughter turned 1, that she needed to find somewhere safer. She chose the United States. She went through the legal process. She followed the rules. She built a life. And then, early on a Tuesday morning in March 2026, ICE agents surrounded a news car in a parking lot in South Nashville, and she was gone. Juan Rodriguez described what his daughter had faced in Colombia in terms that translate clearly across borders and languages. There are a lot of problems, including armed groups, guerrillas, corrupt politicians. When you report, you'll find that some of these people don't like what you're reporting on, and they'll get bothered and think they have to get rid of the reporter because the reporter is making too much noise and informing the public. He said that about Colombia. But the people in that Nashville parking lot who surrounded his daughter's car were not armed guerrillas. They were federal agents of the United States government. And his daughter was making noise about what they were doing. Whether those two things were connected, whether the reporting and the arrest were causally linked, is exactly what a federal court was being asked to determine. As of this video, Stephanie Rodriguez is being held at a detention center in Louisiana. A hearing is scheduled for March 21st. Her attorneys have filed bond motions. The federal court case is active. The First Amendment arguments are before a judge. The outcome is not yet written. But the stakes are clear. If the court rules in Rodriguez's favor, if the arrest is found to be warrantless, if the retaliation argument is accepted, if she is released, it sends a message. It says that journalists cannot be targeted by the agencies they cover. It says that immigration enforcement has constitutional limits. It says that the law means what it says. If the court rules against her, if the detention is upheld, if the First Amendment arguments are dismissed, if she is deported, it also sends a message. It says that a journalist who covers ICE can be detained by ICE. It says that a valid work permit, and a pending green card application, and a marriage to an American citizen and years of following the rules can all be swept aside. It says that the law can be bent when the right agencies want it bent badly enough. Press freedom organizations are watching. Immigration law scholars are watching. Every journalist who has ever stood in a public space documenting government agents at work is watching. Because Estefany Rodriguez is a journalist doing journalism. And what happens to her tells us something about what America is, right now, in this moment. Not what it aspires to be. Not what its founding documents declare. What it actually is, in practice, when a mother is taken from a parking lot in a news car while her daughter rides a school bus, and a federal court has to decide whether that was legal. Estefany Rodriguez came to the United States because she believed in what this country claims to stand for. She believed that a journalist could do her job here without being killed for it. She believed that if you followed the rules would protect you. She believed that the First Amendment was real, not just a line in a document, but a living commitment that the country would honor. She covered IC because someone had to. She showed up to document the arrests because the people being arrested had names and stories and rights, and someone needed to make sure the world knew that. She ran toward the fire, as her colleague said, because that is what journalists do. And then the fire came for her. The parking lot. The surrounded news car. Her husband's voice saying, "I realized it was IC before she did." Her daughter on the school bus, not yet knowing. The transfer to Alabama. The transfer to Louisiana. And a federal courtroom, where a judge is being asked to answer one of the most fundamental questions a democracy can face. Can the government silence a journalist not with a prison sentence, but with an immigration process? Can it neutralize a reporter not through censorship, but through detention? Can it come for the press the way it comes for everyone else, and simply call it enforcement? We don't have the final answer yet. But we have the story. And the story, Estefany Rodriguez's story, deserves to be told completely, loudly, and without apology. Because that is what she was doing when they surrounded her car. She was telling the story. And so are we. If you believe that a free press is not negotiable, that journalists cannot be detained by the agencies they cover, share this video. Put it in front of people who need to understand what's at stake. And drop in the comments, what do you think a court should do when a reporter is arrested without a warrant for covering the agency that arrested her? Should that be a First Amendment case? Should it matter that she's an immigrant? This story is still unfolding. Subscribe so you don't miss the updates. Because Estefany Rodriguez is still in that detention center. Her daughter is still waiting. And the courtroom door is still open.